The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are often described as necessary battles for freedom, justice, and democracy. We are told they were responses to unprecedented acts of terror, fought to defend the West from extremism. But what if that was only part of the story? What if the real reasons for these wars were hidden from the public, cloaked behind patriotic speeches and endless news cycles of fear? Many researchers and conspiracy theorists argue that these wars were never truly about protecting the people. Instead, they were orchestrated by Western leaders as part of a deliberate strategy to destabilize the Middle East, opening the door for resource extraction and global control. They suggest that behind the flag waving and calls for unity, there was a calculated plan unfolding. A plan that would not only reshape the Middle East, but the world itself. And woven into this narrative is something even darker: the idea of a new world order. A global elite that manipulates nations, orchestrates wars, and exploits chaos to bring about centralized power. Could Iraq and Afghanistan have been the stepping stones in that larger vision? Tonight, we'll peel back the layers of these theories. We'll explore the evidence, the strange coincidences, and the unanswered questions that continue to haunt the story of the War on Terror. And as we do, one thing becomes clear: the truth we were told may not be the truth at all. To understand the theories surrounding Iraq and Afghanistan, we first need to revisit the official narrative. In 2001, following the devastating attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. The stated goal was to dismantle al-Qaeda, remove the Taliban from power, and prevent future terrorist attacks. 2 years later, the world watched as American and British forces rolled into Iraq. The justification: weapons of mass destruction. Leaders like George W. Bush and Tony Blair assured the world that Saddam Hussein possessed chemical and biological weapons that posed a grave threat to global security. It was painted as a preemptive strike, one necessary to keep the world safe. But those weapons were never found. The intelligence, we later learned, was deeply flawed, if not outright fabricated. And with that revelation, suspicion began to grow. If the justification for war was based on lies, then what was the real motive? Critics point to geography and resources. Afghanistan is a gateway, a crossroads of Central Asia, strategically vital for oil and gas pipeline routes. Iraq, on the other hand, is the beating heart of Middle Eastern oil. To conspiracy researchers, the invasions weren't about terrorism at all. They were about control. Control of energy, control of territory, and control of the global economy. No theory about these wars can avoid the shadow of 9/11. For many, it was the moment the world changed forever. But to others, it was the event that unlocked a far more sinister plot. The idea of 9/11 being a false flag operation, an attack, staged or at least permitted by elements within the US government, has persisted for decades. Supporters of this theory point to documents like the Project for the New American Century, a neoconservative think tank, that openly stated in 1997 that the United States needed a catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor, to justify expanding its influence overseas. And then, just 4 years later, America suffered its most devastating attack since Pearl Harbor. Was this merely coincidence, or was it prophecy fulfilled? The rapid response also raises questions. Within weeks of the attack, military plans for Afghanistan were in motion, as though they had been drawn up long before 9/11 occurred. Critics argue that the attacks provided the perfect excuse to implement long-standing plans for Middle Eastern intervention. Plans that otherwise would have been politically impossible to sell. And then there's the case of Iraq. Despite the lack of any direct connection to 9/11, the Bush administration continually linked Saddam Hussein to terrorism. Through repetition and media saturation, the American public was convinced Iraq was involved. If this narrative was built on falsehoods, was it a mistake or part of a deliberate deception? Looking back, the wars did not bring peace. Afghanistan endured 20 years of fighting, only to see the Taliban return to power in 2021. Iraq was shattered, its government toppled, and its society fragmented. Instead of eliminating terrorism, these wars arguably expanded it, giving rise to groups like ISIS that thrived in the chaos. Conspiracy researchers argue this was no accident. They point to a strategy of controlled chaos, where destabilization isn't a failure, but the goal itself. A divided, weakened Middle East cannot stand up to Western influence. A fragmented Iraq cannot resist foreign oil contracts, and Afghanistan, mired in war, cannot resist pipeline negotiations. Even the destruction of infrastructure raises questions. Bombings took out water systems, hospitals, power plants, the lifeblood of civilian life. Was this collateral damage or a calculated move to keep these nations crippled and dependent on foreign reconstruction? Reconstruction contracts, after all, were quickly awarded to Western firms, many with ties to the same politicians who launched the wars. This is the essence of the destabilization agenda theory. By breaking nations apart, the West ensures they can never unite, never resist, and never reclaim full sovereignty. Instead, they remain pawns in a global chess game. Follow the money. It's an old rule, but it often reveals the truth. After the invasion of Iraq, Western oil giants like BP, Shell, and ExxonMobil secured multi-billion-dollar contracts. Private firms like Halliburton, once led by Vice President Dick Cheney, earned billions more from reconstruction projects. In other words, while ordinary Iraqis suffered, corporations tied to Western power circles thrived. But Iraq wasn't the only prize. Afghanistan held immense untapped potential. A 2010 US Geological Survey revealed the country possessed over $1 trillion in mineral wealth, copper, iron, and most importantly, lithium, a resource critical for modern batteries and the future of green technology. Was the war about terrorism, or was it about quietly securing the resources that would power the 21st century? And then there's the opium trade. Before 2001, the Taliban had restricted opium production. After the invasion, Afghanistan's opium cultivation exploded, eventually supplying over 80% of the world's heroin. Was this accidental, or was the drug trade exploited by intelligence agencies to fund covert operations, just as it had been in Vietnam with the Golden Triangle? To critics, the evidence is clear. These wars enriched corporations, secured access to vital resources, and fueled shadow economies. They weren't wars of defense, they were wars of profit. All of this ties into a larger, more chilling theory: the creation of a one-world order. The idea that global elites, bankers, oil magnates, intelligence agencies, and politicians are working together to create a centralized system of control. The Middle East wars, according to this theory, were stepping stones. By controlling the world's most resource-rich region, the elites control energy, and by extension, economies everywhere. But the control didn't stop overseas. At home, Western nations used the wars to justify a surveillance state. The Patriot Act allowed unprecedented monitoring of citizens. Airport security became invasive. Mass data collection was normalized, all in the name of fighting terrorism. Conspiracy researchers argue this is exactly how elites operate. They create crises abroad, then use the fear generated to erode freedoms at home. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan didn't just destabilize the Middle East, They destabilized democracy itself, slowly conditioning populations to accept less freedom in exchange for the illusion of safety. The end goal: a world where nations no longer act independently, but are subsumed into a global authority. A new world order where chaos is manufactured, wars are orchestrated, and sovereignty is an illusion. So what are we left with? On one hand, the official story: wars fought for freedom, justice, and security. On the other, a darker narrative of deception, destabilization, and exploitation. If these wars were about freedom, why did Iraq and Afghanistan end up as failed states? If they were about safety, why did terrorism only spread further? And if they were about justice, why did corporations and defense contractors, not ordinary people, walk away as the biggest winners? Skeptics will argue these are coincidences, accidents of war. But to conspiracy theorists, the pattern is too clear. Wars that enrich the powerful, strip nations of resources, and erode liberty at home don't look like failures. They look like successes for those who benefit most. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Or perhaps the truth has been hiding in plain sight all along. Iraq and Afghanistan may have ended, but the ripple effects are still being felt today. And if the one world order theory is correct, then these wars were only the beginning. Stepping stones toward a future where chaos and control walk hand in hand. So, were the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan really about freedom? Or were they part of something much bigger? A carefully orchestrated plan for power, profit, and control? The truth might never be fully revealed, but one thing is certain: the questions aren't going away. What do you think? Were these wars fought for justice or for the new world order? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden history behind world events, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, stay curious.